Hi, everyone. Welcome to our presentation today. The topic of our presentation is establishing evidence of validity for assessments in non-tested content areas. My name is Fanny Coward from Texas Tech University.
Hello, everyone. We're glad that you can make it to this webinar. I am Jeremy Wagner, Director of STEM and Advanced Academics from Lubbock Cooper ISD. For today's learning, we're going to look at and answer three essential questions. One, what are the qualities of an effective assessment and why is validity important? Two, what is content validity and how do we establish it in your assessments? And three, how can teachers create an assessment with content validity, with a specific example from a CTE course? Dr. Coward will cover the first two questions with her expertise in assessment, and I'll cover the last question with a practical example from experiences from districts already undergoing this process.
Let me first start with the essential question number one. What are the quality of effective assessment and why is validity important? If you are evaluating assessment or a test, whether it is your own, one that is developed by another teacher, or a test that is developed by a commercial test publisher, you will need some criteria. Unlike potential criteria for chocolate cake judging, in which my preference might be very different from yours, there are far fewer disputes regarding judging the quality of an assessment. These are validity, reliability, and absence of bias. You probably know these terms already, but let me review quickly. In short, validity is about whether you are assessing what you are supposed to be assessing. Reliability is about the consistency of your assessment results. And the absence of bias is the degree to which assessment procedures are free of elements that would offend or penalize students on the basis of gender, ethnicity, and so on. Validity is by far the most important of the three. Let's dive into why validity is the most important. As I mentioned earlier, validity is about whether you are assessing what you are supposed to be assessing. There are different types of validity, such as content validity, criterion validity, and construct validity. Regardless of the type of validity, validity reflects the defensibility of inferences made on the basis of assessment outcomes. For example, if you say you want to create a test to make decisions about whether your student can speak Chinese, a test that has majority of the content in English or in Spanish will not produce a result in which you can make defensible and sensible decision regarding whether your student can speak Chinese or not. Since you want to see if they can speak Chinese, having a written exam format rather than an oral exam format will also cause issues in validity. If convincing evidence is gathered that an assessment does have validity, we can be assured that it will also have reasonable, reliable scores and consistency. And it is unlikely to have biases present. That is why validity is the most important, as you can consistently measure the wrong thing. Again, validity is all about whether you are assessing what you are supposed to be assessing, so that you can create defensible inferences based on the assessment result. If you are creating a new assessment that will be used to support district decision about designation in non-tested subject, you must first focus on the type of validity called content validity. Let me explain why. And this leads us to essential question number two. What is content validity and how to establish it in your assessment? The scenario of teaching typically should be that we identify our learning goals in class based on the state standard. Then we teach our students so that our student can accomplish those learning goals. Finally, we have assessment to answer the following question. How well have my student achieved the learning goals or master what I want them to learn after my instruction? For teacher incentive allotment, the school district is supposed to pick which of their teacher is best at bringing about student growth towards standard. If you're going to have a good assessment that does that, it has to be based on the state standards and the extent to which it represents the content of the state standards. Let me remind you of these designations. Recognized teachers will have 55% of students meet or exceed expected growth. Exemplary teacher will have 60% of students meet or exceed expected growth. Master student will have 70% of students to meet or exceed expected growth. Since content validity is about how well your assessment adequately represents the content of curriculum standards being measured, it fits nicely with the goal of teacher incentive allotment. Content validity provides evidence that assessment measures what it intends to measure, and that helps you to make defensible inferences about student learning and ultimately about teacher designation. Remember, regardless of what type of validity, validity is about, are you assessing what you are supposed to be assessing, and create a defensible inferences. Can you defend effectively that the decision or meaning you make based on the assessment result is correct? Is an important question to ask yourself. To ensure content validity, you need to make sure your created assessment and the state standards are aligned. This alignment means that not only your assessment matches the standard you want to measure, but also your assessment items have an excellent representativeness of a set of content standards. To include only a handful of standards in your assessment content will be insufficient and decrease the defensibility of your assessment inferences. These days, the notion of content often refers to factual information. However, content should be broadly defined, not only factual information, but also skills, attitudes, dispositions. CTE courses should think outside the box and are encouraged to use performance-based assessments as well. Since for teacher incentive allotment, you want to create an assessment that can distinguish teachers whose teaching can result in most student gains. Alignment among standards, goals, teaching, and assessment is a must. Teaching to the content of the assessment and assess the content of your teaching can ensure content validity. This also will make sure your assessment is free of bias as you teach all students the content of the assessment, regardless who they are. How do you go about gathering evidence of content validity? There are 3 major stages in assessment related to this, as you need to keep records of your process. Identifying assessment content to represent the state standards, getting feedback on assessment created, after assessment data collected. No matter what stage you are in, remember that content validity is based on human judgment. The number is not the focus in content validity. The better you can illustrate how you come to that human judgment, the more effective you will be demonstrating content validity. So the strategy I will talk about next should be very helpful to you. To make sure the assessment has alignment and good representation of the standards, you can identify the assessment content using one of the following strategies during the development of your assessment. First, a panel of district content experts, individually or by mail or during an extended face-to-face session, recommends the knowledge or skills that should be measured by the new assessment based on the state standards. 2, the proposed new content of a new test is systematically contrasted and compared with a list of topics derived from the content included in the 5 leading textbooks in that subject. 3, association of subject matter experts, such as Association of Secondary School Chemistry Teachers, provides suggestions or reviews of the proposed content to be measured by the new assessment. These 3 are all good strategies to use. Then, after the assessment is created, one strategy I recommend for establishing validity is to have an association of a subject matter expert or a panel of experts judge how well the assessment represents the content that should be assessed by giving a rating. For example, ask them to estimate the percent of the assessment content they just reviewed represent state standards. If a content panel's review yields an average of 85%, that's very good. 50% means there might be a problem of content validity. Because assessment bias distorts student performance, it can interfere with assessment validity. Therefore, after you have assessment data and are able to desegregate assessment results by standards to examine student growth, you should check if there is noticeable disparity between subgroups of students. If there is, it does not necessarily mean that your assessment is biased, but it is a red flag and signifies the need to double check on your assessment to make sure it is free of bias. This process can ensure you do have content validity as well. Essentially, what you need to know is that content validity is based on human judgment, and the better you can illustrate how you come to that judgment, the more effective you will be demonstrating content validity.
Now, on to question number 3, or essential question 3. How can teachers create an assessment with content validity? Specifically, we're going to look at an example of this through the lens of a CTE course, because usually with your core content courses, assessments are relatively easy to come by or to create. Teachers have been trained very well on how to read assessment items, and even potentially they have STAR tests that give them a lot of resources and potential options outside of some of the options that a CTE course might have. The overall goal is to create a record of student work that will help make an accurate decision about a teacher's designation for the teacher incentive allotment. That means you need to have some kind of data to back up and support the decision to label a teacher either as recognized, exemplary, or a master teacher under the teacher incentive allotment. Keep in mind that those designations are going to be under review. So you need to put in careful consideration into what type of metric is best for each individual content and each individual grade level. We're going to talk about some of those here in just a little bit. But again, just for these next several slides, we're going to be using a CTE course for our lens. So there are 4 basic critical steps that come into play when we're trying to create some sort of metric or some sort of assessment for a CTE course. Just like Dr. Coward mentioned on slides 15 and 16, the first is to review the state standards or the TEKS. The state standards are at the core of any course, whether it's a core content or a CTE course or anything in between. And so it's a really good idea to begin by collaborating with colleagues, hopefully people that teach either something very similar or the exact same thing as you, and even content experts potentially outside of your school system, so that you can pick the most important skills that are in your CTE course. Then you need to create an assessment of some kind. This assessment can be a traditional assessment, something like a multiple choice exam, or in many cases for CTE, it's probably going to be something more performance based rather than a traditional assessment. Regardless of whatever type of assessment you go with, you need to ensure alignment with your priority standards that you identified in Step A, and wherever possible, try to send the assessment that you've created with the criteria for your performance assessment out for some kind of external review. Experts outside of your actual classroom that are in the field that your course is tied to can provide a lot of extra weight and credibility for whatever it is that you've put together. Next, you'll need to make sure that you're aligning your teaching throughout the entire year with the standards and with the assessment that was created and the expectations for student performance. You cannot actually expect students to meet the bar if what's being delivered in class is not aligning with what's being expected from the assessment based on the standards. Finally, once most of the year has passed and you're able to collect all of your data, or you're able to provide whatever assessment that you've put together, you have to review and disaggregate the assessment data results, as Dr. Coward mentioned before. It's critical that they're examined by the standards in order to determine student growth. We're going to talk a little bit more about student growth in just a minute, but that it really is key. We want students to demonstrate that they've improved in their skill, that they've grown from point A to point B from the beginning to the end of the year, and that is a direct result of the teacher's instructional skill and influence with those students. This is the starting point of a breakdown on what identifying critical skills might look like for a course such as Introduction to Welding. When we're identifying the critical skills while looking at the standards, we need to identify one overarching skill that can be measured throughout the entire year, not just during one unit or during one 9-week or one 6-week period. This is something that can be looked at, analyzed, and reviewed throughout the entire year. Then we need to identify 3 to 5 follow-up supporting skills that are connected to the actual standards wherever possible. So, as an example, I worked with a welding teacher, and that welding teacher actually wrote the statements on your screen right now. Welding is a very detail-oriented skill, no matter what type of welding is being done. Students must be able to maintain equipment, observe and manipulate the fusion of metals, observe work areas and keep them safe, and analyze situations and make decisions about metal fabrication and repair. The 4 skills that the students need to include that they are a skilled welder, have great eye-hand coordination and adequate vision, strength and stamina, the ability to analyze and solve problems, as well as number skills, and keeping a work area clean and follow proper safety protocols. So, in garnering this bit of information from an actual welding teacher in the field that has taught students how to weld and had those students go out and be very successful, I'm going to be able to work with this teacher and potentially other teachers as a campus administrator or some sort of instructional leader and help them correlate this and tie this all together into some sort of performance assessment. When creating assessments, whether it's a multiple choice exam, a rubric for student artifacts, or a student learning objective, collaboration with colleagues and experts is really critical. When collaborating, generally, the more people that you can get involved, the better it is that you're going to be able to support and justify the decisions that are being made for the designation of a teacher. But at a minimum, it's great if you can get 3 people involved with the decision-making process when you're collaborating. 3 minds working on a growth measure, such as a student learning objective or results from a pre and post test, help ensure that those things that Dr. Coward was talking about earlier, about validity, reliability, and the assessments being bias-free, are cross-checked through support of each other. And then it's also important to keep records, documenting those decisions, and be able to share those decisions with others. So questions that you need to ask yourself and be prepared to answer are there teachers in your district that actually teach this content that you can collaborate with? Do you work in a district that has more than one teacher teaching the same thing or something very similar that you can work with? Are there teachers in a nearby district? If you're in a rural area or if you're in a small suburb school, are there neighboring districts that you can try to collaborate with? Think about teachers that you might have met at a conference or at some sort of competition related to your content, those sorts of things. When working together, most of the communication can be done digitally if needed, especially if you're in a small school that's isolated and a long distance from others. Use things like Google Meets and Zoom. There are many different platforms where you can actually just communicate with each other via video conferencing, or just shooting emails back and forth will do. Don't forget to go through that process of writing, sending that information, getting feedback, and then redrafting if needed. And again, just a reminder to record that process. Write down the steps that you went through, the people that were involved, and summarize the changes and how you came to consensus on some of those changes. Now, I say summarize because you don't necessarily need to detail every little minutia, but it is a good idea to get enough specificity put in there so that when this is reviewed, the selection of a teacher and the met criteria shows that the process was rigorous enough. It should be clear that yes, indeed, if a teacher can do these things, that teacher is deserving of a designation as recognized, exemplary, or master teacher. Going back to the input I received from an actual welding teacher, on the left, we have the teacher statements, and on the right, we're going to have the corresponding skill statements that need to be considered in whatever assessment is being created. Before, the welding teacher said it's very important to be detail-oriented. You've got to manipulate fusion metals. You've got to be able to stay safe and analyze and make decisions. The overarching skill focus for the entire year could read as, the student needs to demonstrate appropriate welding and cutting skills with an emphasis on safe practices in handling materials in hazardous conditions. That's something that is connected to the standards in various ways that can be measured throughout the entire year. And that statement can then be carried over into something like a student learning objective or portfolio. We'll talk about these here in just a minute. Then we have those 4 skill statements that the teacher detailed that can be connected to very specific standards. The student needs to have knowledge of welding currents. They need to have proper cutting techniques, such as piercing, straight line, and bevel cutting. They need to have safe operating practices, such as proper setup, tool selection, safety equipment, and the accuracy of readings, with a slew of standards connected to all of those statements. And they need to have an appropriate measurement and math skills associated with welding. All of those statements that the teacher listed are critical because this teacher knows their subject. They know what's important in what they're teaching, and they're actually found in the standards and can be used to help substantiate teacher selection for the incentive allotment, especially once the assessment has been finalized. Now that we've identified the critical skills and the critical standards, we need to actually get into creating the performance assessment and making sure that it is aligned to the state standards. Student growth shows the effectiveness of the instruction in the classroom and helps to identify the most effective teachers in any school or district. Basically, before you dive headfirst into which one assessment type you're going to pick, you need to know a little bit about the 4 types. So when we use welding as our context, let's look at these 4 types and decide which one would be most appropriate for welding. The value-added measure, or VAM model, is a statistical measure usually done by some sort of psychometric firm that takes star results from one year to the next and provides an actual quantified number about the teacher's impact and the teacher's influence on students' instruction. Then you have district-created pre-tests and post-tests. These typically follow a multiple choice structure that their district created or potentially purchased from a third party that are given at strategic points throughout the school year so that you can measure growth from, say, the beginning to the middle and to the end of the year. Now, with welding, it's possible to write a multiple choice test with a district pre and post test. But if we think about welding and what those students are actually doing and what the teacher has identified as the most critical skills, student learning objectives or portfolios might be the more appropriate choice. Student learning objectives are a version of a performance-based assessment that is based on the identified critical skills for the course and requires the students to actually produce something. With student learning objectives, the data that is gathered throughout the year can be quantified from something like a chapter assessment or a skill check. They can also be qualitative, where something is measured against a rubric. The SLO, or student learning objective, in and of itself, once it's written, is essentially the rubric through which students are measured at various points throughout the year for that overarching skill. And finally, we have portfolios, which might be the route you want to go for something like a welding course. It is a version of a performance-based assessment based on identifying critical skills of a course or content, but requires student artifacts to be generated in order to evaluate the student's skills against a rubric or the standards that were selected for the criteria of selection. Continuing with the welding example, we've decided that an SLO or portfolio is probably the best for a welding context. When writing SLOs or using portfolios, one of the best things you can do is actually go out and try to utilize the Texas Education Agency's training and materials for SLOs at texasslo.org. There are videos, rubrics, examples to follow, and it walks you through step by step how to form a student learning objective. Additionally, many of the service centers throughout the state provide student learning objective training in the year. Now, what if I want to do a portfolio instead of an SLO? Well, portfolios follow a very similar process when being created. The difference between an SLO and portfolio is the type of data that's gathered. Whereas an SLO gets data points throughout the year through something like a test that's given, a portfolio follows a similar structure and creation, but requires student artifacts in order to be judged against skill progress throughout the year. So when doing either an SLO or portfolio, you're going to have the skill focus throughout the entire year, that one overarching skill that can be measured throughout, and supporting skills that help you measure growth against the main skill. In the long run, you're going to look for evidence of growth data from formative assessments or student artifacts measured against the rubric that's created. And within these, you're going to create what are called initial skill profiles and target skill profiles. Basically, you're going to identify where do you expect students to be when they come into your classroom, and what are those critical skills, and where do you think students need to be by the time that they're leaving your classroom at the end of the year. Those are your target skills. Near the end of the year, after you have gathered all of the data that you absolutely can, you need to actually answer this question. Did the students grow, and was that growth a direct result of the teacher's instruction and the result of the teacher's influence? So ask this hard question and then support it with results from the use of whatever assessment it is that you've created. It's important to disaggregate those results and find out the answers to these questions. Did the students gain equally across the standards? Did the students make similar gains across sections that the teacher teaches or across different class periods? Is there evidence of bias among different groups? Look at the ethnicities and the socioeconomic backgrounds of the students. Did the results match expectations? Did the students grow to a point that you can say justifiably that the expectations of the course are actually being met? And what percentage of students met or exceeded the expectation? When we look at those percentages, exceeding the expectation can be a very big indicator that you have a highly effective teacher in a classroom. And so that's something to definitely look into when trying to differentiate perhaps between a recognized teacher, an exemplary teacher, or a master's teacher.
One more point we would like to add is that content validity requires you to have a good representation of standards in a particular subject, but sometimes standard-based assessment can be instructionally insensitive in that there are just way too many standards and no teachers can cover that many. In this situation, if only modest number of standards are included in assessment, then it is crucial that the standards or goals you pick for the assessment are exceptionally important and typically high-level cognitive skills that subsume an array of sub-skills. Just like the welding example Jeremy gave, Jeremy and the welding teacher found an overarching skill set to represent its assessment.
To round things out, this brings us to our summary. When we're trying to establish evidence of validity for assessments in non-tested content areas, the three major qualities are that the assessments be bias-free, valid, and reliable. They need to basically produce similar results every time it's given in the sense that they're measuring the same thing in the same way across all groups of students. And they are actually connected to the content that's being taught in the state standards. Content validity is the most essential quality. This is where the assessment aligns to the learning goals of the TEKS for the instruction. We need to consider development of the assessments. You have to collaborate when writing where possible. You need to have expert review of assessments when possible. Student growth measures, depending on what assessment is being used, need to be considered. If you're going to be using value-added measure, a pretest or protest, or an SLO or portfolio needs to be considered. And when calculating growth, you need to answer and figure out, how am I going to determine if a teacher's instruction actually resulted in student growth? There are a number of different metrics, and you can do some research on how to actually calculate those things. And then finally, to bring us to a close, we've got our resources page. Here we've linked directly into the slideshow the SLO and the portfolio site from TEA, texasslo.org. We've also embedded a resource that you could access for quality item writing. If you're worried about a core content or something that can be assessed through multiple choice assessments, the guidance from item writing is very, very helpful to help you generate a bias-free, reliable, and valid assessments. And finally, we've added a direct link to the Texas Teacher Incentive Allotment website.
Thank you for your time and for your interest on this topic. That concludes our presentation. If you have questions, here is my contact information from Texas Tech University.
Just like Dr. Coward said, we really appreciate y'all being here, and we really mean it. If you have questions or concerns, please don't hesitate to reach out to either of us. We really appreciate your time, and thanks for coming.